My name is Nia Washington. I am 32 years old, and I am currently sitting in a federal courtroom, being framed for a felony by my own flesh and blood. She has not worked a single day since college. The booming voice of Pastor Desmond Washington echoed off the mahogany walls. He stood on the witness stand, tears streaming down his face, his trembling finger pointing directly at me. I sat at the defense table, my face a mask of absolute calm, while the jury gasped. My own father was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He gripped the edges of the wooden stand, looking at the judge with the eyes of a broken man. Your Honor, my daughter is a parasite. She is empty, lazy, and when my beautiful wife lay dying in hospice, Naya was busy draining $3 million from her trust fund to fuel her lavish lifestyle. My father thinks I am an unemployed loser who cannot afford a decent lawyer. What he does not know is that I am the director of cyber intelligence for the Pentagon, and I hold a top-secret security clearance. Before I tell you how I dismantled his entire life in front of a federal judge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had your own family try to bury you alive just to save themselves, hit the like button and subscribe. You are going to want to hear what happens when the United States government gets involved in family drama. The courtroom was suffocatingly quiet after his outburst. The jury, a diverse group of Atlanta locals, leaned forward in their seats. They were already captivated by him. Everyone in Atlanta knew Pastor Desmond Washington. He was a pillar of the community, the man who organized food drives and led the largest congregation in Buckhead. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed, projecting the exact image of a respectable grieving widower. But I knew the truth. I knew about the gambling debts and the empty church coffers. The plaintiff attorney, a slick lawyer named Harrison, approached the stand. He spoke in a gentle, coaxing tone. Pastor Washington, please tell the jury about your family background. We want to understand the environment Nia was raised in. My father wiped his eyes with a pristine white handkerchief. We gave her everything. He began, his voice shaking with manufactured grief. My late wife Evelyn and I worked our entire lives to build a legacy for our girls. We lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs. We paid for private schools, piano lessons, and European summer camps. We tried to instill the values of hard work and faith in our children. Her older sister Dominique took those lessons to heart. But Nia, he paused, letting out a heavy sigh. Nia was always different. I watched the jurors taking notes. Two middle-aged women in the front row were looking at me with pure disgust. I did not break eye contact with my father. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, feeling the cold metal of my encrypted government phone in my pocket. Harrison paced in front of the jury box. You say she was different, Pastor. How so? She was ungrateful, my father replied, leaning closer to the microphone. The moment she graduated from college, she simply stopped trying. While her sister built a career and a family, Nia refused to work. We begged her to get a job. I offered her positions at the church, but she said she was too good for that. For 10 years she has been a ghost, living off handouts, traveling the world on my dime, contributing absolutely nothing to society. It took everything in my power not to laugh out loud. Traveling the world on his dime. That was his version of the truth. He thought I was backpacking through Europe or lounging on beaches. He had no idea that my travels involved extracting data from compromised servers in Eastern Europe and neutralizing cyber threats against the United States power grid. My work was highly classified, meaning my cover story to my family was always that of a struggling freelance consultant. They assumed I was broke and failing, and I let them believe it because it was the easiest way to maintain my security clearance without answering questions. But Harrison was not done. He turned toward the jury, his face hardening. Pastor Washington, let us move to the most difficult part of this ordeal. Let us talk about the final days of your wife, Evelyn. At the mention of my mother, my chest tightened. This was the part that hurt. Not because of what he was saying, but because I missed her every single day. My father let out a sob that echoed through the room. It was devastating, he cried. Evelyn was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors gave her 6 months. Our entire family dropped everything to be by her side. My oldest daughter, Dominique, basically moved into the hospital room. My son-in-law, Terrence, took over the family finances so I could focus on my wife. We were a united front in our darkest hour. And where was Nia? Harrison asked, his voice dripping with judgment. My father pointed that trembling finger at me again. She was gone. She disappeared. When my wife was taking her final breaths, begging to see her youngest daughter one last time, Nia was nowhere to be found. She ignored our calls. She abandoned her own mother. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The judge, a strict former military man named Sterling, glared down at me from the bench. If looks could kill, I would have dropped dead on the spot. I swallowed hard, keeping my expression entirely neutral. The truth was that when my mother went into sudden organ failure, I was locked inside an underground bunker in Virginia handling a Tier 1 national security breach. I had surrendered my phone. I had no contact with the outside world for 72 hours. By the time I emerged and saw the missed calls, she was already gone. It was the greatest regret of my life, but I could not explain it to them. I could not explain it to anyone. Harrison walked back to his table and picked up a thick stack of financial documents. He slammed them down on the podium. And it was during this agonizing time while you were burying your wife that you discovered the ultimate betrayal. Is that correct? Yes, my father choked out, burying his face in his hands. We opened Evelyn Trust Fund to pay for the medical bills and the funeral. We expected to find the $3 million she had saved for her grandchildren, but it was empty. The accounts were drained. Every single penny had been wired out over the course of 3 months. Harrison turned to the jury, holding up the bank statements. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the transfer logs right here. $3 million moved systematically into offshore accounts registered under the name Nia Washington. She did not just abandon her dying mother. She robbed her blind. She stole the family legacy to fund her decade of laziness. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I could feel the hatred radiating from the gallery. My own lawyer, Elijah Vance, sat quietly next to me, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. He was a small, unassuming man, and the opposing counsel clearly thought he was an overworked public defender I had hired out of desperation. They thought this trial was going to be a quick execution. My father looked directly into my eyes from the witness stand. I saw the pure malice hiding behind his tears. He was enjoying this. He was systematically destroying my reputation, banking on the fact that I had no evidence to defend myself. He needed me to be the villain. Because if the jury believed I was the thief, they would never look at his own financial records. They would never discover what he and Terrence had really done with that money. Harrison thanked my father and returned to his seat. The judge struck his gavel to quiet the room. Plaintiff, you may call your next witness. Harrison stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a triumphant smirk. Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Mr. Terrence Brooks to the stand. I watched my brother-in-law strut down the aisle. Terrence was 38, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than his car, exuding the arrogance of a man who thought he had outsmarted everyone in the room. He walked past my table, slowing down just enough to look me up and down. He leaned in slightly, and though the microphone could not pick it up, his voice was crystal clear to me. I did not flinch. I did not react. I just watched him climb the steps to the witness box, completely unaware that he was walking straight into a federal trap. Terrence settled into the heavy wooden chair of the witness stand. He adjusted his silk tie, shot a confident smile at the jury box, and waited for Harrison to begin. Terrence always knew how to play a room. He had built his entire career on charm and empty promises, convincing hardworking people to invest in his sketchy housing developments. To the jury, he looked like the epitome of black excellence. A strong, successful family man stepping up in a time of crisis. I knew he was a fraud who was currently underwater on 3 different commercial loans. Please state your name and occupation for the record, Harrison instructed, pacing slowly in front of the stand. My name is Terrence Brooks. I am the founder and CEO of Brooks Premier Real Estate, a luxury development firm here in Atlanta. Terrence spoke with a smooth, practiced cadence. His voice was deep and reassuring. Mr. Brooks, Can you explain your role within the Washington family during Evelyn Washington's final months? Terrence sighed, his expression shifting from confident CEO to burdened son-in-law. It was a dark time for all of us. When my mother-in-law was diagnosed, the whole family was paralyzed. Pastor Desmond was completely devastated. He could barely get out of bed, let alone manage the household. My wife Dominique stepped up to handle all the medical care. She was at the hospital day and night, so I took it upon myself to handle the family finances. Somebody had to keep the lights on and make sure the medical bills were paid. And during this difficult period, did you have any contact with the defendant? Nia Washington? Harrison pointed a pen in my direction. Terrence looked at me, shaking his head with a look of profound disappointment. None. We tried. We called her daily. We sent text messages, emails, everything short of a carrier pigeon. She completely ghosted us. It was as if she dropped off the face of the earth. We were terrified something had happened to her, but we were too consumed with the cancer treatments to launch a full investigation. Harrison stopped pacing and leaned on the podium. Did the defendant ever offer an explanation for her absence? No, Terrence replied, his voice hardening. And that is what hurts the most. Even after Evelyn passed, Nia offered no apologies. She offered no tears. She sat at the funeral in the back row, staring at her phone, not speaking a word to her grieving father or sister. It was chilling. She exhibited a complete lack of empathy. Her silence was not just disrespectful, it was calculated. She was avoiding us because she knew what she had done. I sat perfectly still, listening to him weaponize my training against me. As a federal intelligence operative, stoicism was drilled into me. Showing emotion in high-stakes environments was a liability. During my mother's funeral, I was monitoring a localized server breach on that phone to prevent a national security leak. My silence was the only thing keeping me from breaking down entirely. But Terrence spun my composure into sociopathy. He painted my quiet grief as the cold, calculating demeanor of a thief. The jury ate it up. A young man in the second row shook his head in disgust. An older woman glared at me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Terrence had successfully transformed my stoic nature into undeniable proof of guilt. He was setting the stage perfectly. Let us talk about what you found when you took over the finances, Harrison prompted, shifting the focus to the core of the lawsuit. Terrence let out a heavy breath, rubbing his temples as if the memory alone gave him a migraine. As the executor of the estate, I needed to consolidate Evelyn's assets to cover the mounting hospice care costs. I went to the bank to access the family trust fund. I was expecting to find the $3 million Evelyn had saved over her lifetime. And what did you find, Mr. Brooks? Nothing, Terrence said, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. The account was bled dry. There was barely enough left to cover the monthly maintenance fee. I panicked. I thought there had been a bank error. I demanded a full audit of the transaction history. Harrison walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick binder. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Terrence. I direct your attention to Exhibit A. Can you identify this document for the court? Terrence opened the binder, his eyes scanning the pages. Yes, these are the certified bank statements from Evelyn Washington's trust fund, covering the 6 months prior to her death. Could you please read the transaction history for the jury? Walk us through exactly how that money disappeared. Terrence nodded, turning to the first page. He cleared his throat. On October 12th, a wire transfer was initiated for $250,000. The recipient account was traced to a holding company in the Cayman Islands. On November 3rd, another wire transfer, $400,000. This one went to a private banking institution in Zurich, Switzerland. Harrison interrupted. And who was listed as the primary beneficiary on those offshore accounts? Nia Washington, Terrence stated clearly, making sure the microphone caught every syllable. He continued flipping pages, reading out the devastating numbers. December 1st, $300,000 to an account in Cyprus. January 15th, $500,000 to a shell corporation registered in Panama. Every single transaction was authorized using Evelyn's digital signature, but the destination was always an account controlled by Nia. Over the course of 5 months, while her mother was slowly dying in a hospital bed, Nia systematically siphoned away $3 million. The courtroom was thick with tension. The sheer scale of the alleged theft was staggering. Terrence held up the binder displaying the highlighted pages toward the jury box. When I discovered this, I was sick to my stomach. Terrence continued, his voice trembling with manufactured rage. I could not understand how anyone could do this to their own flesh and blood. Pastor Desmond was relying on that money for his retirement. Dominique was relying on it for our children's future. Nia stole everything. Harrison approached the witness stand again. Mr. Brooks, when you discovered these offshore accounts, what did you do? We hired a private investigator, Terrence answered without missing a beat. We needed to know where the money was going. We thought maybe she was in trouble. Maybe she was being blackmailed. We wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. And what did the private investigator find? Terrence looked directly at the jury, shaking his head slowly. He found Nia living a life of absolute luxury. The investigator tracked her to 5-star resorts in Dubai and high-end shopping districts in Paris. We received photographs of her carrying designer handbags that cost more than most people's cars. While we were struggling to figure out how to pay for Evelyn's cremation, Nia was drinking champagne on a yacht. It was a masterful lie. The private investigator's story was entirely fabricated, a desperate attempt to explain away the international locations tied to my financial footprint. Terrence and my father had likely spent thousands of dollars forging these bank statements, manipulating the digital records to point to me. They saw my international travel history, which they assumed was recreational, and built a fraudulent narrative around it. They had no idea that those offshore accounts were highly classified Department of Defense funding portals, encrypted servers used to finance counterterrorism operations overseas. The money I was moving was federal property, and my presence in Dubai and Paris had been under strict diplomatic cover. She is a sociopath, Terrence concluded, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried across the room. She looked at her mother's tragedy not as a loss, but as a payday. She exploited a dying woman. She left her family with nothing, and she has not shown a single ounce of remorse. Harrison let the heavy silence linger in the room. He turned to the judge. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. Thank you, Mr. Harrison, Judge Sterling said, his expression grim. He looked over at my defense table. Does the defense wish to cross-examine the witness? My lawyer, Elijah Vance, slowly stood up. Yes, Your Honor. The judge nodded. You may proceed. But before Elijah could ask his first question, Terrence was instructed to step down from the witness box to retrieve a glass of water from the plaintiff table. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. He had delivered his lines perfectly. He had the jury exactly where he wanted them. As he walked down the small set of wooden stairs, his path took him directly past the defense table where I sat. He did not break his stride, but as he passed by my shoulder, he leaned his head down just a fraction of an inch. A cruel, triumphant smirk stretched across his face. You are going to rot in a cell, you broke loser, he whispered under his breath, his voice dripping with malice. I watched him take his seat back in the witness box, setting his glass of water down with a self-assured thud. Terrence adjusted his cuffs, his posture radiating absolute victory. He had painted me as a monster, and he believed he had already won. My lawyer, Elijah Vance, slowly rose from his chair. Elijah was a small, unassuming man. He wore an off-the-rack brown suit that hung a little too loosely on his frame. He did not carry a thick binder of evidence or a tablet. He held a single dog-eared piece of yellow legal paper. As he walked toward the podium, he looked entirely out of his depth. Mr. Brooks. Elijah began, his voice soft and slightly raspy, lacking the theatrical boom that Harrison had utilized. You testified that you are the founder of Brooks Premier Real Estate. Is that correct? Terrence leaned back, a patronizing smile playing on his lips. Yes, Mr. Vance, that is correct. Elijah adjusted his glasses, squinting at his notepad. And is your firm the sole proprietary owner of a subsidiary holding company named Apex Ventures, LLC? Harrison stood up immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. We are here to discuss the theft of Evelyn Washington's trust fund, not my client's business structure. Judge Sterling looked down at Elijah, his thick gray eyebrows furrowed in irritation. Mr. Vance, where are you going with this? The jury's time is valuable. I am establishing a timeline of the witness's financial activities during the months in question, Your Honor. Elijah replied calmly. It goes directly to the credibility of the bank statements he just presented. Judge Sterling sighed heavily. I will allow it for now. But get to the point, counselor. Terrence cleared his throat, his smile faltering just a fraction of an inch before returning to full strength. Yes, I own Apex Ventures. It is a standard holding company for commercial properties. Elijah nodded slowly, tracing a line on his paper with his pen. Interesting. Now let us move to the dates of these alleged wire transfers. You testified that on November 3rd, $400,000 was wired to an account in Zurich. Mr. Brooks, on that exact same day, did you log onto a computer using an IP address ending in 192.168.1.4? Terrence let out a loud theatrical laugh. He looked directly at the jury, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a confused child. Mr. Vance, I am a real estate developer. I build houses. I do not sit around memorizing my internet protocols. I have no idea what my IP address is. A few jurors chuckled with him. They were clearly on his side. Elijah did not react to the laughter. He simply asked his next question. Do you frequently use a virtual private network or VPN routed through a server location in Boca Raton, Florida? Terrence threw his hands up in mock exasperation. I use the Wi-Fi at my office, and I use the Wi-Fi at the country club. If one of them has a VPN, you would have to ask the IT guy. Harrison stood up again. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is badgering the witness with nonsensical technical jargon to distract from the cold, hard evidence of the theft. Sustained, Judge Sterling barked. Move on, Mr. Vance. This is not a computer science seminar. Elijah looked down at his yellow paper, seemingly flustered. He scratched the back of his neck. My apologies, Your Honor. Mr. Brooks, let us look at the Cayman Islands transfer. You testified that you hired a private investigator to track my client. Yes, I did, Terrence said confidently. Did this investigator provide you with a digital access token for these offshore banking logs, or did you retrieve them yourself using a dark web software program called Phantom Trace? Terrence gripped the wooden railing of the witness box. For a split second, the arrogant facade cracked, revealing a flash of genuine panic in his eyes. He swallowed hard before answering. I have no idea what Phantom Trace is. The investigator handed me a manila folder with the records. It is that simple. Are you aware that the banking logs you submitted to this court contain digital forensic watermarks, indicating they were artificially generated on a laptop registered to your home address? Elijah asked, his voice never rising above a conversational tone. Objection! Harrison shouted, practically leaping out of his chair. This is outrageous. Counsel is testifying, offering baseless conspiracy theories without a single shred of physical evidence. Sustained, Judge Sterling struck his gavel sharply. Mr. Vance, one more question like that and I will hold you in contempt. You will restrict your questions to the evidence submitted, or you will sit down. Terrence recovered his composure, offering the judge an appreciative nod. I think Mr. Vance is watching too many spy movies, Your Honor. He is desperate. The jury's reaction was palpable. The older woman in the front row rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. A younger juror crossed his arms, glaring at Elijah. To them, my lawyer looked completely incompetent. He was throwing wild, invisible punches at a respected businessman. He was making me look guiltier by the second. Elijah took off his glasses, polished them slowly with his tie, and looked over at me. Then he looked back at Terrence. Just one final question, Mr. Brooks. Have you recently met with an individual named Derek Rollins regarding a $2 million deficit in your commercial loan portfolio? Terrence's jaw clenched tight. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking ashen. Derek Rollins was a notorious underground loan shark, operating out of South Atlanta. Terrence knew exactly who he was, and more importantly, Terrence knew that nobody outside of his immediate criminal circle should know that name. I talked to hundreds of contractors and investors every month, Terrence managed to say, his voice losing its smooth cadence. I do not recall every single name. I see, Elijah said softly. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. Terrence practically launched himself out of the chair, eager to escape the line of fire. He walked quickly back to the plaintiff table, sitting down heavily next to my father. They exchanged a tense, whispered conversation, but my father patted him on the back, reassuring him. I remained completely silent, my hands folded perfectly on the table in front of me. I could feel the hatred from the gallery pressing down on my shoulders like physical weights. The jury thought I was a cold, arrogant criminal who refused to defend herself. They did not understand my silence. They could not comprehend that my silence was the only thing keeping me out of a federal penitentiary. Due to my top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance, I was bound by the National Security Act and the Espionage Act. I was legally prohibited from discussing my employment, my projects, or my financial footprint in any unclassified setting. The offshore accounts Terrence had just presented to the court were not shell companies I used to hide stolen money. They were heavily encrypted Department of Defense funding portals. I had personally built that financial architecture to funnel black budget resources into covert cyber operations overseas. Terrence had hired a hacker to forge bank statements tying my name to those specific international routing numbers because he saw them pinging on my home network before I had fully scrubbed my digital footprint. He thought he had caught me hiding money. He had absolutely no idea he had just submitted classified federal intelligence infrastructure into a public court record. If I stood up right now and yelled the truth, if I told the judge that those accounts belonged to the Pentagon, I would be committing a severe felony. I would be breaching national security protocols. I could be arrested on the spot by federal marshals and sent to Leavenworth Prison for treason. I had to sit there and take the abuse. I had to let my own father and brother-in-law drag my name through the mud, destroying my reputation in front of my entire community. I had to listen to them use my dead mother's memory as a weapon to cover up their own massive, crippling debts. The urge to scream was blinding. The emotional pain of watching my family betray me for a payout was a heavy, suffocating pressure in my chest, but I relied on my training. I boxed up the emotions, locked them in the darkest corner of my mind, and focused entirely on the mission. Elijah was not incompetent, he was stalling. He was meticulously laying the groundwork on the court record, forcing Terrence to commit perjury under oath multiple times. We were just waiting for the final piece of the trap to fall into place. We were waiting for the authorization from my superiors in Washington to declassify the specific digital kill switch I needed to end this. Judge Sterling looked at the clock on the wall, then down at the plaintiff table. Mr. Harrison, do you have any redirect for Mr. Brooks, or are you ready to call your next witness? Harrison stood up, buttoning his jacket with a renewed sense of dramatic flair. He knew the jury was completely on his side. He was ready to deliver the emotional knockout blow. No redirect, Your Honor, Harrison announced, his voice ringing clearly through the courtroom. At this time, the plaintiff calls our star witness. We call Dominique Washington Brooks to the stand. I slowly turned my head to look at the gallery. My older sister Dominique stood up from the front row. She was dressed in a tailored black dress, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, ready to perform the greatest tragic role of her life. Dominique walked down the center aisle with the slow, measured steps of a grieving daughter. Her tailored black designer suit fit flawlessly, conveying both immense wealth and appropriate mourning. She swore to tell the whole truth with a wavering voice, her hand trembling just enough on the Bible to elicit sympathetic glances from the jury box. She sat down, smoothed her skirt, and looked at Harrison with wide, tear-filled eyes. Please state your name for the court, Harrison said softly, treating her like fragile glass. Dominique Washington Brooks, she replied, her voice breathy and delicate. Mrs. Brooks, I know this is incredibly difficult for you, Harrison began, leaning against the wooden podium. Can you tell the jury what your life was like during your mother's final months? Dominique took a deep, shuddering breath. It was a complete nightmare. The cancer was incredibly aggressive. When the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do, I made a choice. I walked away from my lucrative position at a luxury public relations firm. I put my marriage to Terrence on the back burner. I moved back into my parents' house so my mother would never have to spend a single night alone. I was the one changing her IV bags. I was the one wiping her forehead when the fever spiked to dangerous levels in the middle of the night. I slept on a hard, uncomfortable cot next to her hospice bed for 4 straight months. I watched the strongest woman I knew waste away to nothing, and I bore the absolute weight of that trauma so the rest of the family could function. And where was your sister Nia during this grueling 4-month period? Dominique turned her head slowly to look at me. Her expression was a masterclass in profound disappointment. She was gone. She packed her bags right after the terminal diagnosis and simply vanished. She said she could not handle the emotional stress of watching our mother decline. She said she needed to protect her own peace. I sat perfectly still, my face entirely blank, my hands resting lightly on the defense table. Protect my peace. That was an incredibly creative way to describe being urgently airlifted by military helicopter to an underground command bunker hidden deep inside Cheyenne Mountain. While Dominique was supposedly changing IV bags and playing the martyr, I was standing in front of a massive wall of digital monitors, tracking a highly coordinated ransomware attack initiated by a hostile foreign intelligence agency. The malicious code was specifically designed to cripple the power grid across the entire eastern seaboard. Hospitals, emergency response networks, and financial institutions were mere seconds away from going completely dark. My team of government analysts and I had exactly 72 hours to write a complex countermeasure and deploy it before millions of innocent Americans lost power in the dead of winter. I was drinking stale coffee, sleeping under a metal desk for 20-minute intervals, and fighting a silent, invisible war while 4-star generals paced nervously behind my chair. Under strict federal security protocols, I was stripped of all personal communication devices. I could not call home. I could not send a text message. I could not tell them where I was or what I was doing to save lives. But to the jury, Dominique's narrative was the absolute and unquestionable truth. I was the selfish, heartless brat who ran away from a dying woman to go on a luxury vacation. Harrison stepped closer to the witness box, his face a picture of grim sympathy. Did you try to reach her when the end was near? We tried absolutely everything. Dominique sobbed, a single perfect tear escaping her eye and rolling gracefully down her cheek. The doctors told us she had less than 24 hours left. My mother was drifting in and out of consciousness. In her few lucid moments, she kept asking for Nia. She just wanted to hold her youngest daughter's hand one last time before she passed. I called Nia dozens of times. I left frantic voicemails begging her to come back to Atlanta. But she ignored all of them. My mother died looking at the bedroom doorway, waiting for a daughter who never came. The courtroom was dead silent, save for the muffled sniffles of a female juror in the front row, who was actively dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Dominique had them completely wrapped around her manicured finger. She had successfully positioned herself as the hero, the ultimate martyr who sacrificed her own happiness for family duty. I was the monster in the room. Harrison let the heavy silence stretch for a long moment, maximizing the emotional impact of her testimony. Mrs. Brooks, he finally said, his voice dropping an octave to convey utmost seriousness. We have established that the defendant abandoned the family in their darkest hour, and we have seen the financial records showing she drained $3 million from the family trust fund. The question the jury is really struggling with is why? Why would your own sister do something so incredibly callous? Dominique reached for a fresh tissue, dabbing the corners of her eyes carefully to avoid smudging her expensive makeup. Because she hated us, she whispered into the microphone. She has always hated us. Can you elaborate on that for the court? Dominique sat up a little straighter, preparing to deliver the psychological kill shot she had undoubtedly rehearsed for weeks. It is hard to talk about family secrets. But our family had a very specific image to uphold in the community. My father is a prominent figure. I was the older sister, the one who did everything exactly right. I went to the right private schools, joined the right elite sorority, married the right successful man. Nia and I are very different. I felt a familiar cold knot form in my stomach. She was about to play the oldest, ugliest card in the deck, the colorism card. Nia always felt inadequate. Dominique continued, her voice gaining a confident edge. We look different. I took after our mother's side of the family. I have lighter skin, different hair features that society generally favors. Nia took after our father's side. She is much darker. Growing up, the church community, the private school parents, they always fawned over me. They constantly called me the beautiful one. Nia internalized that attention. She became bitterly resentful. She convinced herself that our parents loved me more simply because of how I looked. She thought she was the dark-skinned disappointment of the Washington family. It was a stunningly calculated twist of reality. Dominique was openly admitting the systemic colorism that plagued our elite social circles, but she was expertly twisting it to make herself the innocent victim of my supposed jealousy. The actual truth was far more insidious. Our father was the one who actively perpetuated the favoritism. He was the one who paraded Dominique in front of the congregation every Sunday, calling her his perfect angel, while keeping me firmly in the background. He constantly criticized my natural hair, my darker skin tone, and my complete lack of interest in high society pageantry. During family portraits, I was always positioned in the back. I was never jealous of Dominique. I pitied her. She was a hollow shell of a person entirely dependent on external validation, designer labels, and my father's conditional love. She had no real identity of her own. But in this courtroom, under the bright fluorescent lights, she was weaponizing the trauma of my childhood to establish an ironclad motive for federal fraud. She deeply resented the fact that my parents relied on me. Dominique told the jury, looking directly at them with wide, earnest eyes. She hated that I was the one managing the household when Mom got sick. She felt completely powerless and overshadowed. So she decided to take the one thing that mattered most to my father: the family legacy. That trust fund was not just money. It was everything my parents had worked decades to build. Nia stole it to punish us for a lifetime of perceived slights. She wanted to leave us with absolutely nothing. She drained those accounts out of pure venomous spite. Harrison nodded slowly, letting the heavy, damaging accusations settle over the room. The jurors were nodding along with her. The narrative made perfect, terrifying sense to them. The bitter, jealous younger sister seeking ultimate revenge on the beautiful, perfect older sister. It was a story as old as time. Harrison walked back to the plaintiff table and picked up a single crisp sheet of paper enclosed in a clear plastic protective sleeve. He held it up high for the judge to see. "Your Honor," Harrison announced, his voice echoing in the quiet room. In light of the defendant's horrific behavior during her mother's final days, Evelyn Washington realized she had made a terrible mistake. She realized the true toxic nature of her youngest daughter, and she took immediate legal action to correct it before it was too late. Harrison approached the witness stand and handed the document to Dominique. "Mrs. Brooks, can you please identify this document for the court?" Dominique looked down at the paper. Her hands shook slightly, a brilliant, subtle continuation of her award-winning performance. She took a deep breath, looking up at the judge with an expression of profound sadness. Judge Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing at the mention of a new will. The entire courtroom held its breath, waiting for the final nail to be driven into my coffin. I watched Dominique clutch the paper to her chest as if it were a sacred artifact. "Yes," she said softly. "This is a document we found hidden in my mother's personal safe shortly after she passed away. It is her newly discovered updated will." Turned his attention directly to the judge. His posture shifted from the sympathetic advocate to a hardened prosecutor. "Your Honor." Harrison began, his voice ringing with cold authority. "The document Mrs. Brooks just identified is not merely a piece of paper. It is the final, desperate cry of a dying woman trying to protect her family from a predator. And that predator is sitting right here in this courtroom." Harrison paced slowly toward the jury box. He held the plastic sleeve containing the forged will up to the light so every juror could clearly see the signature. This will explicitly disinherit Nia Washington. It leaves the entirety of the $2 million physical estate, the family home, the vehicles, the heirlooms solely to Dominique and Terrence Brooks. It also explicitly leaves the $3 million trust fund to them. Evelyn Washington knew her youngest daughter was entirely capable of financial violence. She tried to legally build a wall to keep Nia out. But she was too late. Nia did not wait for the will to be read. She bypassed the legal system entirely and simply took the money while her mother was fighting for her last breath. This was the escalating conflict. They were not just trying to take the remaining assets. They were trying to completely erase my existence from the family legacy. By submitting this forged document, Terrence and my father were creating an impenetrable legal firewall. If they could convince the court that I was disinherited prior to the theft, it made my supposed actions look even more malicious. It transformed me from a greedy heir stealing her advance inheritance into a complete outsider robbing a grieving family. Harrison continued his relentless assault on my character. We are not just dealing with a family dispute over a misplaced inheritance today. We are dealing with a calculated, cold-blooded heist. The defendant used her intimate knowledge of the family finances, her mother's digital passwords, and a network of untraceable offshore accounts to commit grand larceny. She did this while refusing to answer phone calls from her own dying mother. The sheer level of depravity required to execute a scheme like this is difficult for any decent person to comprehend. I looked at the jury. The younger man in the second row was shaking his head, his face flushed with righteous anger. The older woman was gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. Harrison had played them perfectly. He had woven a narrative of such intense emotional cruelty that no logical defense could pierce it. He had used my own stoicism, my required federal silence, as the ultimate proof of my sociopathy. My father, Pastor Desmond, let out another perfectly timed sob from the plaintiff table. Dominique reached over and rubbed his back, playing the role of the devoted, exhausted caretaker to absolute perfection. They were a flawless picture of victimization, and I was the dark, silent storm cloud that had ruined their lives. But Harrison was not finished. He walked back to the podium and picked up a thick, heavy legal binder. He did not look at the jury this time. He looked directly up at Judge Sterling. "Your Honor," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a serious, almost dangerous register. "We came into this courtroom seeking a civil judgment. We came here to recover the $3 million that was stolen from the Evelyn Washington Trust and to formally execute this updated will to protect the remaining $2 million estate. But as we have laid out the evidence over the past 2 days, it has become abundantly clear that civil remedies are entirely insufficient for the magnitude of these offenses." Judge Sterling leaned forward, his steely gaze fixed on Harrison. "What exactly are you proposing, Counselor?" Harrison placed his hands flat on the podium, leaning into the microphone. "We are formally requesting that this court not only rule in favor of the plaintiff regarding the civil asset forfeiture, but that you immediately refer this case to the United States Attorney Office for criminal prosecution." A collective gasp ripped through the gallery behind me. Even the court reporter paused her typing for a fraction of a second. A criminal referral from a federal judge was not a mere suggestion. It was a fast track to a grand jury indictment. Harrison raised his voice over the rapidly growing murmurs of the crowd. "The evidence presented today clearly demonstrates that the defendant engaged in systematic federal wire fraud. She initiated unauthorized electronic transfers across international borders to conceal stolen funds. Furthermore, because these funds were stolen from an incapacitated senior citizen who was in hospice care, this constitutes severe elder abuse under federal statutes. We are asking you to bind Nia Washington over to federal custody pending a criminal investigation." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Wire fraud, elder abuse, federal custody. My lawyer, Elijah Vance, finally stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a civil trial. Opposing counsel is attempting to weaponize this court to bypass standard criminal investigative procedures. They are grandstanding for the jury and attempting to intimidate my client." Judge Sterling slammed his gavel down with terrifying force. "Overruled, Mr. Vance. The plaintiff is entirely within their rights to request a criminal referral based on the staggering evidence of fraud presented in this courtroom today. Harrison turned to look at me, a victorious sneer plastered across his face. These are not minor infractions, Your Honor. Federal wire fraud carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Elder abuse carries additional consecutive sentencing. The defendant is a massive flight risk. She clearly has access to offshore accounts and international contacts, as proven by her travel records. If she is allowed to walk out of this courthouse today with a simple civil judgment against her, she will disappear. She will board a plane to Dubai or Switzerland, and this family will never see justice, let alone their stolen money. The trap was fully sprung. It was a masterpiece of legal extortion. Terrence and my father knew they could not actually recover the $3 million through a civil suit because they had already stolen it and lost it themselves. Their actual goal was the criminal referral. They wanted the judge to threaten me with 20 years in federal prison. They were applying the maximum possible pressure, intending to use the looming threat of a criminal indictment to force a settlement in the hallway. They wanted me to be so terrified of prison that I would eagerly sign over my rights to the $2 million physical estate just to make the criminal charges go away. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was just a broke, unemployed woman who had stumbled into a legal nightmare I could not afford to fight. I looked over at my father. He had stopped crying entirely. He was watching me intently, waiting for the panic to set in. He expected me to break. He expected me to lean over to Elijah and beg him to negotiate a plea deal right then and there. Terrence was sitting next to him, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction, adjusting his expensive tie. But I did not break. I sat perfectly still, regulating my breathing. My pulse rested at a calm 60 beats per minute. I was evaluating the variables, calculating the exact moment to deploy my countermeasure. I knew the exact layout of the federal prison system Harrison was threatening me with, because I had designed the cybersecurity infrastructure for half of those facilities. Judge Sterling looked down from the bench. His face was etched with absolute disgust. He was a former military man, a judge who prided himself on honor duty and discipline. To him, there was no crime more heinous than betraying a dying parent for financial gain. He looked at me not as a citizen presumed innocent, but as a convicted felon waiting for a cell assignment. Miss Washington, Judge Sterling addressed me directly, his voice echoing with cold contempt. In my 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a case of such profound moral bankruptcy. The evidence presented against you is staggering. The betrayal of your own mother during her final days is utterly abhorrent. Elijah stood up again, his voice steady despite the tension. Your Honor, my client has not yet had the opportunity to present her defense or call her own witnesses. Judge Sterling glared at Elijah, his patience completely exhausted. Your client has sat there in complete silence while a mountain of financial evidence and a legally binding will were entered into the record. You have offered no alternative explanation for the wire transfers. You have offered no counter-witnesses. You have done nothing but badger a grieving family member about his internet history. I am prepared to rule on the plaintiff's requests. Judge Sterling continued, his voice echoing with absolute finality. I am strongly considering granting the civil judgment in full, recognizing the updated will, and issuing the criminal referral to the district attorney immediately. The courtroom erupted into frantic whispers. Dominique covered her face with her hands, feigning overwhelming relief. Terrence patted my father heavily on the shoulder. They had won. The judge was ready to drop the hammer and send me away. However, Judge Sterling said loudly, raising his hand to silence the chaotic room. Given the severe nature of the requested criminal referral and the potential for immediate federal custody, I am going to review the bank statements and the updated will in my chambers one final time before I issue my official ruling on the record. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel. We will take a 30-minute recess. When we return, I will deliver my decision. And Miss Washington, I suggest you use this time to prepare yourself for the very real possibility that you will not be going home today. He slammed the gavel down with a deafening crack. All rise, the bailiff shouted. The judge stood up, his black robes billowing around him, and walked briskly out of the courtroom through the heavy oak door behind the bench. The jury was quickly escorted out by the bailiffs, several of them shooting me final glares of pure hatred before disappearing into the deliberation room. The gallery immediately buzzed with loud chatter. Reporters rushed out into the hallway to call their editors with updates. The air was thick with the adrenaline of a major conviction. I remained seated at the defense table. Elijah Vance calmly gathered his notes, placed them in his battered leather briefcase, and looked at me. "It is time," he said quietly. I nodded once. "Yes, it is." I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from my suit jacket. I turned toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. As I stepped into the center aisle, I saw my father Dominique and Terrence waiting for me. They had positioned themselves specifically to block my path to the exit. The courtroom was rapidly emptying, leaving us alone in the cavernous space. The fragile masks of grief were entirely gone. As I walked toward them, Terrence stepped forward, a vicious, predatory smile spreading across his face. The real trial was about to begin out in the hallway. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, sealing us in the long marble corridor of the federal courthouse. The hallway was completely empty. The reporters, the curious onlookers, and the bailiffs had already rushed downstairs to the cafeteria or stepped outside for a quick smoke break. It was just the four of us. My lawyer, Elijah, had conveniently stepped into the restroom down the hall, leaving me entirely encircled by the people who shared my blood. Terrence crossed his arms, his expensive tailored suit pulling tight across his broad shoulders. He did not look like a grieving, concerned brother-in-law anymore. He looked like a street enforcer who had just cornered an easy mark in an alleyway. Dominique dropped the crumpled tissue she had been using to dab her fake tears on the witness stand. Her posture straightened instantly, the fragile weeping sister routine vanishing like a puff of smoke. She pulled a gold-plated compact mirror from her designer purse, casually checked her lipstick, and let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "You should have seen your face in there, Nia. You looked absolutely pathetic. You really thought you could walk in here and win against us." My father leaned against the cold marble wall. The pious, heartbroken Pastor Desmond Washington was gone. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, and entirely predatory. "We gave you every opportunity to walk away quietly, Nia," he said, his voice stripped of any fatherly warmth. "We tried to handle this internally, but you had to be stubborn. You always had to make things difficult for this family." I stood my ground, keeping a precise physical distance from Terrence to maintain a tactical advantage. "What exactly is this, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. "An ambush." "It is an intervention," Terrence scoffed, stepping closer so I could smell the overpowering scent of his expensive cologne. "An intervention to save your miserable life. Because right now you are staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence. Judge Sterling hates your guts. He is going to lock you up, throw away the key, and you will be a convicted felon before dinner time." I tilted my head slightly, observing them with clinical detachment. "You and I both know I did not steal that money. You forged that updated will. You forged those bank statements. You just committed massive perjury in front of a federal judge." Terrence laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed loudly down the empty corridor. "So what if I did? Who is going to believe you? You heard Harrison in there. You heard the jury gasping. You are the lazy, unemployed disappointment who abandoned her dying mother to go on vacation. I am the successful CEO who stepped up to save the family from ruin. Your own lawyer cannot even string two sentences together without getting yelled at by the judge. The narrative is set, Nia. You are the villain. You lost the moment you walked into this building." Dominique snapped her compact shut and pointed it directly at my chest. "You owe us this. You have contributed absolutely nothing to this family for 10 years. It is time you paid your dues." I looked at my sister, genuinely fascinated by the sheer depth of her delusion. "Paid my dues for what, Dominique? To fund your luxury lifestyle, to pay for Terrence's fake real estate empire." Terrence's smile vanished instantly. His face darkened with a sudden violent rage. He stepped squarely into my personal space, pointing a thick, aggressive finger right at my face. Do not talk about my business, you broke loser. You have no idea how the real world works. You have no idea what it takes to keep a multi-million-dollar operation afloat in this economy. Then enlighten me, I said calmly, looking directly into his angry eyes. Tell me why you need to steal from a dead woman. Terence scoffed, glancing at my father. Pastor Desmond gave a slow, deliberate nod, signaling that it was time to put all their cards on the table. They needed to show me exactly how desperate they were to prove that they had nothing to lose and would absolutely send me to prison if I did not comply with their demands. You want the truth? Terence sneered, leaning in close enough for me to see the sweat forming on his forehead. The truth is, my commercial developments went belly up 18 months ago. The housing market shifted, the banks pulled their funding, and I was left holding the bag on 3 massive properties. I was facing total bankruptcy. I needed capital fast, so I went to a private lender to bridge the gap. A private lender, I repeated flatly. You mean Derek Rollins? The underground loan shark my lawyer just asked you about on the stand. Terrence's jaw clenched so hard a muscle popped in his cheek. Yes, Derek Rollins. And Derek does not care about market fluctuations or construction delays. He cares about his $2 million. He gave me a hard deadline, Nia. If I do not pay him back by the end of this month, he is not going to take me to civil court. He is going to send people to my house. He is going to threaten my wife and my kids. He is going to take my life. Dominique crossed her arms, glaring at me with raw, unfiltered resentment. We are fighting for our physical survival. We needed that trust fund money to pay off the debt and save our family from being destroyed by criminals. But you already took the trust fund money, I pointed out, maintaining my steady, unbothered tone. $3 million disappeared from Mom's account. If you took it to pay off the loan shark, why are you still in debt? Where did the money actually go? The corridor went dead silent. Terence looked away, suddenly finding the marble floor very interesting. Dominique bit her lip and glared at our father. Pastor Desmond pushed himself off the wall. He walked toward me, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply on the tile. He stopped just a few feet away, running a hand over his perfectly groomed silver hair. It was not all for Terence, he admitted, his voice low and gravelly. I looked at the man who had raised me, the man who stood in a pulpit every Sunday and preached about honesty, integrity, and spiritual salvation. What did you do, Dad? My father let out a heavy sigh, looking entirely unapologetic. I had some investments go bad as well, personal investments, things I could not exactly disclose to the church board or the congregation. You mean gambling? I corrected him, slicing through his polite terminology. I know about the weekend trips to Las Vegas. I know about the underground poker games in Buckhead. Desmond's eyes flashed with sudden defensive anger. Do not judge me, Nia. I carry the weight of an entire community on my shoulders. I counsel the grieving, I save broken marriages, I keep that massive church running every single day. I am allowed an outlet to relieve the pressure. But the debts got out of hand. I borrowed money from the church building fund to cover a few losses at the tables. I fully intended to pay it back with my next big win, but I hit a bad streak. The church board is demanding a full financial audit next month. If they find out the building fund is empty, I will be ruined. My reputation, my career, my entire life will be destroyed. I will be the one going to federal prison. So you stole from your dying wife instead, I said, my voice finally dropping to a freezing temperature. You and Terence drained Mom's trust fund together. You split the $3 million. Terence used his half to make a partial payment to his loan shark, and you used your half to try and win back the church funds at the casino. And you both lost it all again. Desmond did not flinch. He looked me dead in the eye. Evelyn was dying anyway. She did not need the money where she was going. We did. We are the pillars of this family. We are the ones who matter to the community. I stared at him, feeling a profound sense of disgust settle deep in my bones. And when the cash was gone and your massive debts were still there, you realized you needed to liquidate the physical estate, the house, the cars, the jewelry. But you knew Mom's real will split everything 50-50 between me and Dominique. So you forged a new will to cut me out entirely, and you forged those bank statements to frame me for the initial theft just in case the bank ever investigated the missing $3 million. Terence smiled, a cruel, highly satisfied look on his face. Look at you. The unemployed loser finally figured it out. Yes, Nia. We framed you. We set you up perfectly. And Harrison just handed the judge everything he needs to send you to federal prison for wire fraud and elder abuse. You are the perfect scapegoat. Nobody will miss you. Nobody will question why the bitter, jealous sister stole the money. It is a flawless plan. Dominique unzipped her designer purse and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and a heavy silver pen. She shoved them hard against my chest, forcing me to grab them or let them fall to the floor. "This is your only way out," she commanded. "These are binding legal waivers. You are going to sign them right now in front of a notary we have waiting downstairs in the lobby. You are going to formally relinquish any and all claims to the Evelyn Washington estate. You will admit in writing to taking the $3 million, and you will sign over your equity in the family home as restitution to us." "And if I refuse," I asked, looking down at the thick stack of papers. Terrence leaned in so close I could feel his hot breath on my cheek. "If you refuse, we walk back into that courtroom and we let Judge Sterling issue the criminal referral. We will hand all our fabricated evidence directly over to the FBI. You will be arrested before the sun goes down today. You will spend the next 20 years locked in a concrete box. I hear federal prison is really tough on arrogant girls who think they are smarter than everyone else." My father placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, his grip tight and threatening. "Sign the papers, Nia. Sacrifice yourself for the greater good of this family. If you do this, I will ask Harrison to drop the criminal charges. We will settle for the civil judgment and let you walk away with your freedom. You will be broke, but at least you will not be in a cage. Do the right thing for once in your miserable life." They stood there in the empty hallway, a united front of absolute corruption. They had laid out their entire criminal conspiracy, completely confident that I was too weak and too terrified to do anything about it. They thought the looming threat of federal prison would reduce me to a weeping, compliant victim. They expected me to beg for mercy. They expected tears. I looked down at the legal documents in my hands. Then I looked at my sister, my brother-in-law, and my father. I did not cry. I did not shake. I did not beg. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my smartphone. It was not a standard consumer device. It was encased in military-grade titanium, running a custom encrypted operating system designed exclusively for high-level Department of Defense personnel. "What are you doing?" Terrence snapped, reaching for the device. "Put that away and sign the damn papers." I stepped back, easily evading his grasp. I looked down at the black screen, letting the biometric scanner read my fingerprint and my iris simultaneously. The screen unlocked, bypassing layers of federal firewalls, and displayed a simple command terminal interface. I used my thumb to type 3 words. "Operation Sandbox. Execute." I hit the send button. A small green light flashed at the top of the device, confirming that the encrypted signal had bounced off a secure military satellite and hit the servers at the Pentagon. The digital guillotine had just dropped. I dropped the unsigned legal waivers onto the marble floor. The pages scattered wildly around Terrence's expensive leather shoes. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at the 3 of them with absolute terrifying calm. "I will see you inside," I told them. Without waiting for a response, I turned on my heel and pushed the heavy oak doors open, walking back into the courtroom to finish the war they had started. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom felt surprisingly light as I pushed them open. The gallery was already filling back up. Reporters were hurrying down the aisles, taking their seats with notepads ready, eager to hear a federal judge issue a criminal referral. The air buzzed with the toxic electric energy of impending doom. I walked straight to the defense table and took my seat next to Elijah Vance. He looked at me, noting my steady breathing and perfectly straight posture. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He knew the command had been sent. Seconds later, the double doors at the back of the room swung open again. My father, Dominique, and Terrence marched in. They had quickly reassembled their masks of grief and righteous indignation, but underneath it I could see the confusion. My refusal to sign their extortion papers in the hallway had completely derailed their timeline. Terrence shot me a glare filled with pure venom as he pulled out his chair at the plaintiff table. Dominique sat down, adjusting her designer skirt, refusing to look in my direction. Pastor Desmond folded his hands on the mahogany surface, staring straight ahead, projecting the image of a heartbroken patriarch. They were confident that my defiance was just a desperate bluff. They fully expected Judge Sterling to return, strike his gavel, and order federal marshals to take me into custody. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. Judge Sterling emerged from his chambers. His black robe swept around him as he took his seat at the elevated bench. He arranged his files with sharp, deliberate movements. The courtroom fell completely silent. The tension was suffocating. Every eye in the room was fixed on me, waiting for the executioner to drop the axe. "Be seated," Judge Sterling commanded. He looked down at the plaintiff table, giving my father a brief nod of sympathy before turning his cold, unforgiving gaze toward me. "I have reviewed the financial documents, the updated will, and the plaintiff's request for a criminal referral. The evidence of grand larceny and elder abuse presented in this court is overwhelming. Before I issue my final ruling and contact the United States Attorney, I will ask the defense one last time. Does the defense have any remaining motions, or are we concluded?" Harrison stood up, practically glowing with victory. "The plaintiff rests, Your Honor. We ask the court to proceed with the ruling." Elijah Vance slowly stood up from his chair. He buttoned his cheap brown suit jacket, picked up his blank yellow legal pad, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the defense has not yet presented its case. We respectfully request the opportunity to call our witness." Harrison let out a loud, theatrical scoff. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a blatant delay tactic. The defense had 2 days to cross-examine our witnesses and failed to produce a single shred of exculpatory evidence. They are wasting the court's time to delay the inevitable criminal referral." Judge Sterling frowned, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "Mr. Vance, you have offered absolutely no defense thus far. Unless you have a witness who can miraculously explain away forged signatures and offshore wire transfers, I suggest you sit down and let this court proceed. I have exactly one witness, Your Honor." Elijah said, his voice calm and entirely unshaken by the judge's hostility. "And her testimony will address every single piece of evidence the plaintiff has submitted." Judge Sterling let out a harsh sigh. "Very well, call your witness. But I warn you, Mr. Vance, if this is a frivolous attempt to stall justice, I will hold you in contempt of court." Elijah turned, slightly extending his hand toward me. "The defense calls Nia Washington to the stand." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Even the court reporter looked up from her transcription machine in shock. In cases involving severe financial fraud and looming federal criminal charges, the absolute last thing a defense attorney does is put their client on the stand. It opens them up to devastating cross-examination and the massive risk of perjury. It was considered legal suicide. At the plaintiff table, Terrence leaned back in his chair and actually smiled. He whispered something to Dominique, who covered her mouth to hide a smirk. My father shook his head, looking at me with feigned pity. They thought I was walking directly into a slaughterhouse. They thought Harrison was going to rip me apart on the record, providing the prosecution with a taped confession. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and walked purposefully toward the witness stand. I did not look at the jury. I did not look at my family. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the wooden railing of the box. I placed my left hand on the Bible held out by the bailiff and raised my right hand. I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then I took my seat. Elijah walked toward the podium, but before he could ask a single question, Harrison sprang out of his chair like a coiled snake. "Your Honor," Harrison shouted, pointing a finger at me. "If the defendant is taking the stand to testify regarding the financial matters of the Evelyn Washington estate, the plaintiff demands the right to immediately voir dire the witness. We have the right to question her credibility and her employment history before the defense spins a web of lies." It was an aggressive, highly unusual legal maneuver, but Judge Sterling was already heavily biased against me. The judge nodded sharply. "I agree. The plaintiff is granted wide latitude to question the witness on her background and financial status. Mr. Harrison, you may proceed. Mr. Vance, you will wait your turn." Elijah did not argue. He simply took a step back from the podium, leaving the floor entirely to Harrison. This was part of the strategy. Let the enemy overextend. Let them put all their arrogance on the public record. Harrison marched up to the witness stand, stopping just inches away from the wooden railing. He loomed over me, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. Miss Washington, let us skip the pleasantries. You have sat in this courtroom for 2 days listening to evidence that you stole $3 million from your dying mother. You are currently facing a 20-year federal prison sentence. So let me ask you a very simple question. When was the last time you received a legitimate taxable paycheck? I looked at him, my expression completely blank. I remained silent. Harrison turned to the jury, throwing his hands in the air. Nothing. Still going with the silent treatment. Let the record reflect that the defendant refuses to answer. Let me rephrase the question. Have you held a steady job at any point in the last 10 years since you graduated from college? Again, I did not answer. You are a parasite, Miss Washington. Harrison sneered, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. You lived off your father's generosity. You lived off your sister's hard work. And when they finally cut you off, you resorted to thievery. Where did the $3 million go? We saw the bank statements. We know you wired the money to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Cyprus. Did you really think you could hide from the federal government? Did you really think no one would notice a broke, unemployed woman suddenly moving millions of dollars across international borders? Harrison slammed his hand down on the wooden railing of the witness box, causing a loud crack that made several jurors jump. Answer the question. You took the stand. You swore an oath. Where is the money you stole from Evelyn Washington? I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. My pulse was steady. I was not looking at Harrison anymore. I was looking past him toward the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. I was waiting for the result of the encrypted command I had sent from the hallway. Your Honor, Harrison yelled, turning back to Judge Sterling. The witness is openly defying the court. I ask that you instruct her to answer the questions or immediately hold her in contempt and summon the federal marshals to take her into custody. Judge Sterling leaned over the bench, his face red with anger. Miss Washington, you have waived your right to silence by taking that stand. If you do not answer the plaintiff's questions regarding those offshore accounts this exact second, I will have you arrested for contempt of court, and I will sign the criminal referral immediately. This is your final warning. The courtroom held its breath. Terrence was gripping the edge of his table, practically vibrating with excitement, waiting to see handcuffs slapped on my wrists. Before the judge could strike his gavel, Elijah Vance stepped out from behind the defense table. He did not yell. He did not object. He walked with slow, deliberate purpose straight past Harrison and approached the judge's elevated bench. He reached inside his battered leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. It was not a standard legal document. The envelope was secured with a bright red wax seal, and stamped clearly across the front in thick black ink was the official, unmistakable crest of the United States Department of Defense. Elijah placed the heavy envelope gently on the wooden surface directly in front of Judge Sterling. Your Honor, Elijah said, his voice cutting through the heavy tension of the room like a scalpel. My client cannot answer the plaintiff's questions regarding her employment or the nature of those international bank accounts, because doing so in an unclassified setting would be a violation of the Espionage Act. However, the Secretary of Defense has just authorized the declassification of this specific file for your eyes only. I suggest you open it before you threaten a federal intelligence officer with arrest again. Judge Sterling froze. His heavy wooden gavel halted mid-air, inches above the sounding block. The sheer audacity of Elijah's statement hung in the silent courtroom like a lit fuse. Harrison let out a loud, mocking laugh from the plaintiff table, throwing his hands up in absolute disbelief. Your Honor, this is an absolute circus, Harrison scoffed, turning to look at the jury with a theatrical expression of outrage. A federal intelligence officer. This is a desperate, pathetic fabrication. They are making a mockery of this federal court. I demand that you hold Mr. Vance in contempt immediately and have the bailiffs remove him from the premises. Judge Sterling did not acknowledge Harrison. He did not blink. His steely eyes were locked onto the heavy manila envelope resting on his mahogany bench. As a strict former military man who had served 2 tours overseas, Judge Sterling recognized authentic government issuing. He saw the precise, unmistakable shade of the crimson wax seal. He saw the intricately embossed crest of the United States Department of Defense stamped into the thick paper. It was not something you could casually print off the internet or buy at a local office supply store. It bore the physical weight, the distinct texture, and the undeniable authority of the Pentagon. Mr. Harrison, Judge Sterling set his voice dangerously low and commanding. Sit down and remain entirely silent. Harrison opened his mouth to argue, but the sheer lethal intensity in the judge's eyes forced him to snap his jaw shut. He slowly lowered himself back into his leather chair, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossing his previously arrogant face. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. Every single person in the gallery, the jury box, and the plaintiff table held their breath. Judge Sterling reached out with careful, deliberate hands and picked up the envelope. He inspected the wax seal for any signs of tampering. Finding none, he picked up a silver letter opener from his desk. He slid the blade under the flap, breaking the crimson wax with a sharp, audible crack that echoed through the room like a gunshot. He pulled out a thick stack of watermarked parchment papers. The top sheet bore the official letterhead of the Secretary of Defense, complete with classified authorization, routing numbers, and a direct presidential seal of approval. Judge Sterling adjusted his reading glasses. He began to read. I watched him from the witness stand, maintaining my perfectly neutral posture. I saw the exact moment his entire worldview shifted. It started with a slight furrowing of his thick gray eyebrows. Then the rigid line of his jaw went entirely slack. The natural color drained from his face at an alarming rate, leaving his skin a pale ashen gray. His eyes darted back and forth across the page, absorbing the highly classified reality of my existence. He was reading my operational history. He was reading the explicit confirmation that the bank accounts Terrence had submitted into public evidence were actually encrypted federal funding portals used for national security operations. He realized in a matter of seconds that he had just allowed a smug real estate developer to publicly expose classified Department of Defense infrastructure. He realized he had almost thrown a high-ranking federal intelligence director into a civilian prison based on a forged will and a botched extortion attempt. The sheer gravity of the security breach happening inside his courtroom hit him like a physical blow. Judge Sterling slowly lowered the papers to his desk. His hands were shaking. A man known for his ironclad composure, a man who had presided over cartel bosses and domestic terrorists without breaking a sweat, was visibly trembling. He reached up and slowly took off his reading glasses. He did not look at Harrison. He did not look at my father. He turned his head and looked directly at me. The absolute contempt and disgust he had shown me just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished. In its place was a mixture of profound shock, deep realization, and a sudden sharp respect. I gave him a single imperceptible nod confirming everything he had just read. Judge Sterling picked up his gavel and slammed it down with a deafening explosive force that made the entire room flinch. All rise, Judge Sterling roared, his voice booming with absolute military authority. Bailiffs, lock the doors. Lock them right now. Nobody enters and nobody leaves. This courtroom is now under federal security protocol. The shift in power was instantaneous and violently chaotic. The bailiffs trained to respond to federal emergencies sprinted down the aisles. They slammed the heavy double oak doors shut, sliding the massive deadbolts into place with a heavy metallic clank. They took up tactical positions at every exit, their hands resting cautiously on their duty weapons. The reporters in the gallery began muttering frantically, pulling out their phones, only to realize the judge had likely triggered a signal jammer. The room was entirely sealed off from the outside world. At the plaintiff table, panic erupted. Terrence shot up from his chair, his face slick with sudden sweat. He looked around wildly like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door had just slammed shut. Dominique clutched the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wood, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. My father, Pastor Desmond Washington, could not comprehend the sudden loss of control. His massive ego refused to let him accept the reality unfolding in front of him. He stood up, slamming his hands flat on the table, trying to reclaim his alpha male presence. "Your Honor!" Desmond yelled, his voice echoing in the locked room. "What is the meaning of this? You cannot lock us in here. We are the victims. We demand to know what is in that envelope. My daughter is a liar and a thief." Judge Sterling stood up behind the bench, his black robes flaring out, pointing a lethal finger directly at my father. "Pastor Washington, if you utter one more syllable in my courtroom, I will have you gagged, shackled, and thrown into a federal holding cell for the next 30 days. Sit down and shut your mouth immediately." Desmond's mouth hung open. The holy, untouchable pastor of Atlanta had never been spoken to like that in his entire life. The sheer force of the judge's command stripped away his authority instantly. He collapsed back into his chair, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically toward Terrence. Harrison, the slick plaintiff attorney, was visibly hyperventilating. He was a smart enough lawyer to know that when a federal judge initiates a security protocol and locks the doors, someone's career is about to end and someone is going to jail. Judge Sterling picked up the classified document, his hands steadying as his military discipline overrode his initial shock. He looked out over the stunned, silent jury, and then directly at my family. "The defense has submitted verified, highly classified documentation directly from the United States Department of Defense," Judge Sterling announced, his voice echoing with cold, hard finality. "This document is signed by the Secretary of Defense and carries the absolute authority of the federal government. It completely invalidates the plaintiff's entire case." Judge Sterling turned to the official court reporter who was staring at him with wide eyes. "Let the record reflect the true identity of the witness currently on the stand." He cleared his throat and read aloud. "The witness is Nia Washington. Her official title is Director of Cyber Intelligence for the United States Department of Defense stationed at the Pentagon. She holds a top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information clearance." A collective gasp swept through the jury box. The older woman in the front row, who had been glaring at me with such intense hatred, literally dropped her notepad onto the floor. The young man beside her sat with his mouth completely open. The unemployed, lazy, sociopathic daughter they had spent 2 days despising was suddenly revealed to be one of the highest-ranking intelligence officials in the country. I looked down at my family. It was the most beautiful, satisfying sight I had ever witnessed. Dominique's jaw was practically on the floor, her flawless makeup doing nothing to hide her absolute devastation. Desmond looked like he was about to suffer a massive cardiac event, clutching his chest, staring at me as if I were a ghost. But Terrence was the one breaking down the hardest. His arrogant swagger was entirely gone. He was shaking uncontrollably. He had hired a cheap hacker to forge banking documents, thinking he was framing a defenseless civilian. He had proudly presented those documents in a federal court, completely unaware of the massive, catastrophic mistake he had made. I leaned forward, pulling the microphone closer to my mouth. The screech of the audio feedback made Terrence flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I spoke with the icy, calculated precision of a woman who had just executed a flawless tactical strike. "Those aren't offshore shell accounts, Terrence," I said, staring directly into his terrified, trembling eyes. "Those are encrypted government servers, and tampering with them is an act of cyber terrorism." The words hung in the locked courtroom, heavy and lethal. Cyber terrorism. Terrence physically recoiled as if he had been struck in the face. He collapsed back into his leather chair, the fight completely drained from his body. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Dominique stared at him in sheer panic, her hands trembling so violently that her gold bracelets clattered against the mahogany table. My lawyer, Elijah Vance, did not waste a single second. He walked over to the court's digital projector system, a standard piece of equipment used by attorneys to display evidence to the jury. He bypassed the standard connection ports and pulled a small black decrypted USB drive from his pocket. He plugged it directly into the secure terminal. "Your Honor," Elijah said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Since the plaintiff has chosen to introduce my client's digital footprint into evidence, the defense would like to present our own findings. Judge Sterling, still reeling from the classified document he had just read, nodded slowly. Proceed, Mr. Vance. I kept my eyes locked on Terrence as the projector hummed to life. You see, Terrence? I began, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any sympathy. When you hire a dark web hacker to fabricate bank statements and forge financial connections to classified military infrastructure, you trigger automated defense protocols. The moment your hired associate pinged those secure routing numbers, the National Security Agency flagged the intrusion. The jury watched me with rapt attention. They were no longer looking at a lazy, unemployed daughter. They were looking at a federal director explaining a high-stakes intelligence operation. Because you attempted to frame a federal officer with a top-secret clearance, I continued, the Pentagon authorized an immediate and comprehensive audit of your entire digital existence. We were granted full federal approval to monitor, extract, and decrypt every single piece of electronic data associated with your name, your businesses, and your personal devices. You thought you were hunting me. You had no idea that for the last 2 weeks the full weight of the United States intelligence community has been hunting you. My father, Pastor Desmond, let out a choked gasp. He grabbed his chest, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He knew exactly what a deep dive into his digital life would reveal. The secret bank accounts, the casino wires, the embezzlement from the church building fund. It was all about to be laid bare. Harrison stood up, his legs shaking. Your Honor, this is a gross violation of privacy. They cannot simply hack my clients without a warrant. Judge Sterling glared at him with absolute disdain. Mr. Harrison, unless you want to be indicted as a co-conspirator in a federal cyber-terrorism investigation, I highly suggest you sit down and let the witness finish. The Department of Defense does not need my permission to protect its infrastructure from your client. Harrison sank back into his chair, utterly defeated. He knew his career was over. He had aggressively pushed a case based entirely on forged evidence against a protected government official. He was just trying to survive the day without being arrested himself. I turned my attention back to the large projection screen descending behind the witness stand. The screen glowed bright white, casting harsh shadows across the courtroom. Let us look at the real financial records, I said. Elijah, pull up Exhibit Delta. Elijah typed a command into his laptop. The screen instantly populated with a massive complex spreadsheet. These were not the fake documents Terrence had presented earlier. These were authentic, verified bank logs extracted directly from the servers of Terrence's primary financial institution. The plaintiff testified that he was a successful real estate developer who stepped up to save this family. I told the court, my voice ringing with cold authority. But the metadata tells a very different story. Terrence Brooks is entirely insolvent. His company, Brooks Premier Real Estate, currently carries a negative balance of over $2.4 million. I pointed to a specific highlighted row on the screen. On October 12th, the exact same day, my mother's trust fund was drained of its first $250,000. An identical amount was deposited into a shell company owned by Terrence. 30 minutes later, that exact sum was wired to an offshore account in Antigua, a known clearinghouse for unregulated high-stakes sports betting syndicates. Dominique whipped her head around to stare at her husband, betting she shrieked, her perfect facade shattering completely. What is she talking about, Terrence? You said you paid the contractors. Terrence refused to look at her. He stared at the table, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. I did not stop. I let the digital guillotine fall harder. It was not just gambling, Dominique. Look at November 3rd, $400,000 stolen from the trust, wired immediately to an LLC registered in South Atlanta. That LLC is a front for Derek Rollins, the loan shark Terrence owes his life to. Terrence has been systematically bleeding our dying mother's accounts dry to keep his kneecaps from being broken by organized crime. The courtroom was dead silent except for Dominique's ragged breathing. She was looking at the screen, her eyes wide with horror, as the irrefutable proof of her husband's crimes was displayed for the world to see. And then there is the matter of the updated will, I continued shifting my focus to the most damning piece of their conspiracy. The document you so bravely read for the court, Dominique. The one that conveniently disinherited me and left the entire estate to you and your husband. Elijah clicked another button. The screen shifted, displaying the forged will side by side with a digital breakdown of its metadata. You testified that you found this document in our mother's safe 3 days after the funeral, I said. You testified that she signed it on her deathbed. But digital forensics are incredibly unforgiving. This document was not drafted by a lawyer. It was created on a laptop registered to Terrence's home office IP address. I directed the jury's attention to the specific timestamp highlighted in red on the projector screen. It was created at 2:14 in the morning, exactly 4 days after my mother passed away. You cannot sign a legal document when you are already dead. My father buried his face in his hands, quietly sobbing. This time the tears were genuine. They were tears of absolute terror and shame. But how did they get the signature? I asked, rhetorically, pacing the narrative perfectly. Elijah showed them the overlay. The screen animated. It showed the signature from the forged will. Then a second image appeared on the screen. It was an old family Christmas card from 5 years ago, signed by my mother. The digital software slowly dragged the signature from the Christmas card over the signature on the will. They matched with 100% microscopic perfection. Human beings do not sign their name exactly the same way twice, I explained to the judge and the jury. There are always microscopic variations in pressure and angle. An exact pixel for pixel match is mathematically impossible without digital manipulation. Terrence used a commercial graphic design software to scan her old signature, isolate it, and print it directly onto the forged will. We recovered the original digital art file from his hard drive. It even has his user profile attached to the save history. The destruction was absolute. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was a flawless, undeniable digital confession extracted directly from their own devices. They had walked into a federal court, lied under oath, submitted fabricated financial records, and presented a forged legal document. You tried to use the justice system to steal my inheritance and send me to prison, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You thought I was an easy target because I remained silent. But my silence was not weakness, it was protocol. I was simply giving you enough rope to hang yourselves, Terrence snapped. The crushing weight of the evidence, the reality of the locked doors and the looming threat of federal prison finally broke his mind. He let out a primal, desperate yell. He shoved his chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. He ignored his wife, who was screaming his name. He ignored his lawyer, who was shouting for him to sit down. Terrence bolted. He sprinted down the center aisle of the courtroom, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly on the polished hardwood floor. He was operating on pure, blind panic, desperately trying to escape the consequences of his actions. He reached the heavy double oak doors at the back of the gallery and slammed his shoulder against them with all his might. The doors did not budge. The deadbolts were locked tight. Terrence frantically grabbed the brass handles, rattling them with terrifying violence, screaming for someone to let him out. But there was no escape. The two federal bailiffs, massive men in tactical gear, stepped out from the shadows of the vestibule. They did not draw their weapons. They did not need to. They moved with swift, brutal efficiency. One bailiff grabbed Terrence by the collar of his tailored suit, yanking him backward with enough force to lift him off his feet. The other grabbed his arms, twisting them sharply behind his back. Terrence thrashed and kicked, screaming obscenities, but the bailiff slammed him face first against the heavy wooden doors. The sharp, unmistakable sound of steel handcuffs ratcheting closed echoed loudly across the silent courtroom. Terrence slumped against the heavy oak doors, his chest heaving, his face pressed into the polished wood, as the bailiffs secured his wrists. Dominique let out a piercing shriek, burying her face in her hands, her carefully crafted image of high society elegance completely shattered. Pastor Desmond sat frozen at the plaintiff table, his mouth opening and closing silently, looking like a man who had just watched his entire empire burn to the ground in a matter of seconds. Judge Sterling did not show a single ounce of pity. He glared at Terrence being dragged back toward the plaintiff table and shoved roughly into his chair by the federal bailiffs. Let the record reflect that the plaintiff attempted to flee a secure federal facility. Judge Sterling stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion. He turned his attention to Harrison. Mr. Harrison, do you have any further questions for the witness regarding the evidence she just presented? Harrison slowly stood up. His expensive suit looked suddenly 2 sizes too big. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, soaking into his collar. He looked at Terrence, who was refusing to make eye contact, and then at my father, who was staring blankly at the wall. Harrison realized he was standing on a sinking ship, and he desperately needed to find a single piece of floating debris to cling to. "Your Honor," Harrison stammered, wiping his brow with a trembling hand. "I am deeply disturbed by the evidence the defense has just presented. If what Miss Washington says is true, then my clients have grossly misled me." However, he paused, trying to find a logical thread in the absolute chaos. "However, there is still a massive discrepancy here." Harrison turned to look at me, his eyes wide with desperate confusion. "Miss Washington, you just proved that Terrence Brooks and your father drained $3 million from your mother's trust fund to pay off loan sharks and gambling debts. But Evelyn Washington was a retired homemaker and your father is a pastor. They lived comfortably, but they did not have $3 million in liquid cash just sitting in a bank account. If your father is a chronic gambler, as you claim, how did that much money get into the trust fund in the first place? If they stole the money, whose money did they actually steal?" It was the perfect question. It was the exact opening I had been waiting for since this trial began. I leaned back in the witness chair, looking directly at my father. Pastor Desmond finally met my gaze, and I saw a flicker of absolute dread in his eyes. He knew what was coming. He knew the final, ultimate secret of the Washington family was about to be exposed on the public record. Elijah Vance typed another command into his laptop. The massive projection screen behind me shifted again, displaying a line graph that tracked the historical balance of the Evelyn Washington Trust Fund over the last 5 years. "You are absolutely right, Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the captivated room. "My parents did not have $3 million. In fact, if you look at the screen, you will see exactly what my mother's trust fund looked like 3 years ago." The red line on the graph plummeted in a steep, violent drop, flatlining at absolute zero. 3 years ago, my father's gambling addiction reached its absolute peak, I explained, watching the jury gasp as the numbers appeared on the screen. He took out massive hidden mortgages on the family home in Buckhead. He liquidated my mother's retirement accounts. He secretly drained her original trust fund until there was literally nothing left. My mother was completely bankrupt, and she did not even know it. She thought she was living in a paid-off mansion, secure for the rest of her life. My father had gambled away her entire existence. Harrison gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white. "But the bank statements submitted today show $3 million was in that account just 6 months ago. Where did the capital come from?" I looked at Dominique, who was staring at me with a mixture of horror and dawning comprehension. Then I looked at the jury. "It came from me," I said simply. The courtroom fell dead silent again. The young juror in the front row leaned forward so far he almost fell out of his chair. "I am the Director of Cyber Intelligence for the Pentagon." I continued, my voice steady and completely unapologetic. "I do not just draw a 6-figure government salary. Over the past decade, I have developed and patented highly classified cybersecurity algorithms for the Department of Defense. Those patents are lucrative. When I discovered what my father had done 3 years ago, I had a choice. I could expose him, which would have humiliated my mother and sent her into a fatal stress spiral, or I could fix it quietly. I chose to protect my mother." I pointed to the screen as Elijah brought up a new set of deeply encrypted verified deposit logs. "I quietly paid off the secret mortgages on the Buckhead mansion to save it from foreclosure," I revealed, watching my father shrink into his chair. "I paid off the luxury cars my sister loves to drive. I funded the premium health insurance that paid for my mother's world-class hospice care. And over the course of 2 years, I systematically pumped $3 million of my own money back into her trust fund so she would never have to experience the terror of knowing her husband had ruined her." Dominique let out a choked, gasping breath. She looked at her designer suit, her expensive jewelry, suddenly realizing that every single piece of her lavish lifestyle had been subsidized by the sister she had spent her entire life tormenting. "You called me a parasite?" "Harrison," I said, shifting my gaze back to the sweating attorney. "My family sat in this room and told a federal judge that I was a lazy, unemployed loser who lived off their generosity. They told you I was a dark-skinned disappointment who contributed absolutely nothing. But the truth is, I was the only thing keeping them from living on the streets. I was the silent bankroll funding their illusion of black excellence. They were living off my dime." Judge Sterling took off his glasses again, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if trying to ward off a massive headache. The sheer audacity of the plaintiffs was almost too much for the seasoned judge to process. "So let me understand this, Miss Washington," the judge said, his voice laced with heavy disbelief. "The $3 million that your father and brother-in-law stole from the trust. They were actually stealing your money." "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. "They stole my money, lost it to criminals and casinos, and then had the absolute nerve to drag me into a federal court and sue me for stealing it." Harrison collapsed back into his chair. He buried his face in his hands, completely broken. His career was over. He had aggressively prosecuted a federal intelligence officer for stealing her own money based on forged documents provided by degenerate gamblers. It was a career-ending catastrophe. But the humiliation was not enough. I needed to ensure that the criminal referral they had so eagerly requested for me would be redirected precisely where it belonged. I needed to show the court the true depth of their malicious intent. "They did not just steal my money, Your Honor," I said, my voice hardening into a sharp, unforgiving edge. "They knew exactly what they were doing, and they maliciously conspired to frame me to cover their tracks. They targeted me because they thought my security clearance would prevent me from defending myself. They thought my silence was a vulnerability they could exploit." I turned to Elijah. "Play the audio file." Elijah clicked a file on his desktop. "Earlier, I mentioned that the NSA audit extracted data from all their personal devices. I explained to the court. That includes deleted voicemails and recorded phone calls. This is a conversation that took place between my father and my sister Dominique, exactly 2 weeks after my mother's funeral." The courtroom speakers crackled to life. The audio was crystal clear, enhanced by military-grade software. Desmond's voice echoed through the room, first sounding frantic and breathless. "Dominique Terrence just told me the money is gone. The loan shark took it all. What are we going to do? The estate lawyers are asking for the trust fund records. If they see the withdrawals, I am going to jail." Then Dominique's voice came through. It was not the breathy, delicate voice she had used on the witness stand. It was cold, calculating, and dripping with venom. "Calm down, Dad. Terrence knows a guy who can alter the bank logs. We just need a scapegoat. Someone who cannot fight back." "Who?" Desmond asked on the recording. Nia Dominique replied instantly, her recorded voice filled with cruel satisfaction. "She is broke, she has no lawyer, and nobody likes her anyway. We will say she transferred the money offshore. We will forge a new will, cutting her out just to make her look even worse. If we push hard enough, she will be so terrified of going to prison, she will sign over her half of the house to us. We can sell the house and cover the rest of your debts. It is perfect. She owes us anyway." The recording clicked off, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I looked down at the plaintiff table. Dominique was staring straight ahead, her face completely drained of color, her mouth hanging open in silent horror. My father was weeping openly, his head resting on the mahogany table. Terrence sat perfectly still, his handcuffed wrists resting awkwardly in his lap, realizing that his wife and father-in-law had just been caught on tape orchestrating a federal felony. They had dug their own graves, and I had simply provided the shovels. The silence in the courtroom following the audio recording was heavier than concrete. It pressed down on the room, suffocating the last remaining embers of the Washington family pride. The jury members looked physically sickened. The young man in the front row shook his head in absolute disgust, refusing to even look at the plaintiff table. The older woman, who had spent the first day of the trial glaring at me with unvarnished hatred, now stared at my father with a look of pure, unadulterated revulsion. The shattering of their meticulously crafted facades was instantaneous and complete. Pastor Desmond Washington, the holy patriarch of Buckhead, the spiritual leader to thousands, was reduced to a sniveling, exposed fraud. His tailored charcoal suit suddenly seemed to swallow his diminished frame. He looked small, old, and profoundly pathetic. Dominique, the golden child, the perfect daughter, who had built her entire identity on inherited privilege and public adoration, sat frozen in her chair. The echo of her own venomous voice faded from the courtroom speakers, leaving behind a reality she could no longer manipulate. Her carefully constructed world, built on a foundation of designer labels, country club memberships, and my father's endless praise, was disintegrating under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the federal courthouse. The shock morphed rapidly into a visceral, ugly panic. The instinct for self-preservation is a powerful force, and in families built on toxic conditions, loyalty is always the first casualty. Dominique snapped. She stood up abruptly, her chair screeching violently against the polished hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling manicured finger at Terence, who was still slumped in his chair with his wrists bound in cold steel by the federal bailiffs. "This was your idea," Dominique screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. She completely abandoned her refined, soft-spoken courtroom persona. "You brought that dark web hacker into our home. You told me it was a foolproof plan. You said nobody would ever look twice at Nia because of her travel history. You swore to me that we would get the house and pay off your massive, stupid debts." Terence whipped his head around. His eyes were wide-dilated with a mixture of raw terror and explosive rage. He struggled against his handcuffs, half standing before the massive bailiff behind him, forced him back down into his seat with a hard shove to the shoulder. "My idea?" Terence roared, spittle flying from his lips as he glared at his wife. "You vicious, greedy snake! You were the one who suggested cutting her out of the will entirely. I just needed enough cash to pay Derek Rollins so I would not end up dead in a ditch. You were the one who wanted the Buckhead mansion all to yourself. You wanted her completely ruined because you could not stand the fact that she never bowed down to you like everyone else did." "I did not do anything illegal!" Dominique shrieked, tears of sheer panic streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "I just read the paper you gave me. You forged the signature. You wired the money. You are the criminal Terence." Desmond tried to intervene, raising his shaking hands in a desperate, pathetic, pleading gesture. "Please, please stop shouting," he begged, his voice barely a raspy whisper. "The congregation is going to hear about this. The reporters are writing everything down. We have to maintain our dignity." Dominique turned her fury onto the man she had worshipped her entire life. "Shut up, Dad!" she shrieked, completely obliterating any remaining pretense of filial piety. "Do not talk to me about dignity. You lost the money first. If you had not gambled away every single penny of Mom's trust at the blackjack tables, none of this would have happened. You dragged us into this mess. You stole from the church building fund to feed your addiction, and then you expected us to help you cover it up. You ruined my life. You ruined my marriage." "It is your fault for trusting me," Terence yelled over her, his voice echoing loudly in the locked room. "You knew I was broke 18 months ago. You just wanted to keep playing the rich housewife at the country club. You are as guilty as I am." The jury watched in absolute horror as the wealthy elite Washington family tore each other apart like starving wolves fighting over a rotting carcass. The elegant, sophisticated illusion of black excellence they had so proudly paraded for decades was completely stripped away. Beneath the tailored suits, the expensive jewelry, and the religious titles, there was nothing but profound greed, profound cowardice, and absolute moral rot. Even their own attorney Harrison had physically pushed his heavy leather chair away from the plaintiff table. He sat at the very edge of the defense perimeter, holding his hands up slightly as if trying to ward off the toxic splash zone of their implosion. He was watching his professional career go up in flames, and he wanted no part of the crossfire. I let them scream at each other for a full 2 minutes. I watched the destruction with complete clinical detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. They had brought this entirely upon themselves. When their throats were raw and their breathing became ragged, I leaned forward and adjusted the microphone on the witness stand. "Quiet," I said. It was a single word spoken without raising my voice, but it carried the absolute crushing authority of my federal position. The command cut through their hysterical infighting like a blade. They froze instantly. Dominique slowly turned her head to look at me, her chest heaving. Terence stopped thrashing against his restraints. Desmond looked up from his hands. They realized with sudden terrifying clarity that they were entirely at my mercy. I focused my gaze squarely on my father. He looked back at me, his eyes pleading for a lifeline, for some hidden reserve of daughterly affection that he had systematically destroyed years ago. Every Sunday, for the last 30 years, I began my voice steady, cold, and entirely unforgiving. You stood at a wooden pulpit and preached about the sanctity of family. You preached about honesty, charity, and the unconditional love of God. You told thousands of people how to live their lives, demanding their respect, their obedience, and their tithes. But behind closed doors, you were nothing but a parasite. Desmond flinched as if I had struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. You used my mother as a human shield to hide your gambling addiction. I continued, the truth ringing loudly in the silent courtroom. You used my sister's crippling vanity to maintain your social status in the community. And you used me as a silent bank account, completely willing to sacrifice my freedom and my life to cover up your sins. You do not know the first thing about family. Blood does not make you a father. It just makes you a biological reality. Family protects each other. Family does not forge federal financial documents to send their youngest child to a penitentiary. Tears began to spill from Desmond's eyes, dripping onto his expensive silk tie. 3 years ago, when I bailed you out the first time to save my mother from dying in poverty, I made you sign a strict non-disclosure agreement regarding the financial state of the estate, I told him, watching the blood drain from his face once again. I did it to protect my mother from the deep public humiliation of knowing she was married to a thief. But my mother is gone now, and that agreement had a specific morality clause. I stood up from the witness chair, smoothing the front of my blazer. I looked down at the broken man sitting at the table. As the primary executor of the True Evelyn Washington Trust, and as the sole financial contributor to this family for the last 36 months, I am officially revoking that non-disclosure agreement I announced. I have already authorized my legal team to release the full unredacted financial audit of your personal accounts directly to the board of directors at your church. Every single dime you embezzled from the building fund, every casino wire transfer, and every desperate loan you took from the church coffers is now a matter of public record. Desmond collapsed forward onto the mahogany table, burying his face in his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. The great untouchable Pastor Washington was entirely erased, leaving only a broken, pathetic criminal waiting for his inevitable ruin. Judge Sterling had seen enough. The sheer level of corruption, perjury, and malicious intent that had contaminated his courtroom pushed his renowned military discipline to its absolute breaking point. His face was a mask of furious, righteous indignation. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down on the sounding block with a strike so violently forceful it echoed like thunder across the sealed room. "Enough!" Judge Sterling roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at the plaintiff table, absolutely furious that his courtroom had been used in a calculated attempt to frame a high-ranking federal official. The judge's voice boomed across the room, absolutely furious that his courtroom had been used in a calculated attempt to frame a high-ranking federal official. You did not just walk into a state court to squabble over a petty inheritance. Judge Sterling thundered, his eyes locked onto the 3 trembling figures at the plaintiff table. You walked into a United States federal court. You swore an oath on a Bible you clearly do not respect, and you submitted fabricated financial records and a forged legal document into the Federal Registry. Judge Sterling stood up, his tall frame dominating the space. He pointed to the thick binder of bank statements Harrison had submitted hours earlier. You thought you were executing a clever scheme to steal from your youngest family member, but your arrogance and your profound ignorance blinded you to the reality of what you were actually doing. By manipulating those specific routing numbers and attempting to publicly expose classified Department of Defense financial architecture, you have crossed a line that takes this entirely out of the realm of civil litigation and places it squarely in the jurisdiction of Homeland Security. The jury watched the judge with wide, unblinking eyes. They had been completely swayed by the family's emotional manipulation earlier in the day, but now they looked at my father, sister, and brother-in-law as if they were radioactive. Regarding the civil matter before me, Judge Sterling announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. This lawsuit is a malicious, fraudulent fabrication from start to finish. The plaintiff has presented zero credible evidence of theft by the defendant. In fact, the defense has provided irrefutable proof that the plaintiffs themselves are the actual perpetrators of the financial crimes in question. Therefore, I am immediately dismissing this civil suit with prejudice. You will never be allowed to bring these claims before any court in this country again. Furthermore, the updated will presented today is officially ruled a fraudulent forgery, and the original will dividing the estate equally remains the sole legal directive. Harrison, the slick attorney who had strutted around the courtroom all morning, stood up on trembling legs. "Your Honor," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "In light of the evidence presented by the defense, I must formally request to immediately withdraw as counsel for the plaintiffs. I was completely unaware of the fabricated nature of their evidence." Judge Sterling glared down at him. "Request granted, Mr. Harrison. And I strongly suggest you retain a very good criminal defense attorney for yourself, because the federal prosecutor will absolutely be looking into your role in facilitating this conspiracy. You are dismissed. Get out of my sight." Harrison did not hesitate. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, abandoning his clients completely, and practically sprinted toward the side exit of the courtroom, desperate to escape the blast radius of their destruction. Judge Sterling turned his attention back to my family. "The civil matter is dismissed," he continued, his tone turning incredibly dangerous. "But we are far from finished. This court cannot and will not ignore the staggering volume of federal crimes committed in this room today." He picked up a pen and a piece of official court stationery, writing rapidly as he spoke. "You have committed perjury. You have committed felony forgery. You have engaged in a conspiracy to commit wire fraud. And most egregiously, you have attempted to extort a high-ranking federal intelligence officer holding a top-secret clearance. Attempting to blackmail an official who possesses classified national security information is not just a white-collar crime. It is a direct threat to the security of the United States." My father collapsed forward, resting his head on the wooden table, weeping with loud, ragged sobs. He had spent his entire life building an empire of respectability, hiding behind his clerical collar and his booming sermons. Now every single person in his congregation, every leader in the community, and every member of his family would know exactly what he was. A degenerate gambler, a thief, and a coward. Dominique was hyperventilating, clutching her chest as if she could not draw enough oxygen into her lungs. She looked at Terence, who was still pinned to his chair by the bailiff, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. The reality of her situation was finally crashing down on her. She was not going back to her luxury country club. She was not going to host another charity gala. She was going to be stripped of everything she valued. Judge Sterling signed the document with a heavy, aggressive stroke of his pen. He handed the paper to the court clerk. "I am officially issuing a criminal referral directly to the United States Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And because the defendants pose a massive flight risk and have already demonstrated a willingness to tamper with federal infrastructure, I am denying any possibility of bail pending their arraignment." The judge looked up, signaling the heavily armed tactical bailiff standing near the back wall. "Unlock the doors. Send them in." The bailiff reached over and threw the heavy deadbolts. The thick oak doors swung open. The hallway outside was no longer empty. A team of 6 United States federal marshals stood in the corridor, dressed in tactical gear, their faces stern and entirely focused. They had been waiting right outside the doors since I sent the encrypted command from my phone. The Pentagon had moved with terrifying speed, coordinating with local federal law enforcement to secure the courthouse the moment my security was actively threatened. The marshals marched into the courtroom in a tight, disciplined formation. The heavy thud of their tactical boots on the hardwood floor sounded like a death knell for the Washington family. "Execute the arrest warrants," Judge Sterling commanded from the bench. 2 marshals flanked Terence. Since he was already restrained by the bailiff, they simply grabbed him by the arms and hauled him violently to his feet. He did not fight back this time. His spirit was completely broken. He hung his head, his expensive suit wrinkled and ruined as they read him his Miranda rights. Two other marshals approached Dominique. She shrank back in her chair, holding her hands up in front of her face as if she could physically ward them off. "No, please," she sobbed, her voice a high-pitched, desperate whine. "You cannot do this. I am a victim. My husband lied to me. My father lied to me. I did not do anything wrong. Please look at me. I do not belong in a place like that." "Mayam, stand up and place your hands behind your back," the lead marshal ordered, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "I cannot go to jail," Dominique shrieked, kicking her legs as the marshal reached for her. "I have a reputation. You are ruining my life." The marshal did not argue. He grabbed her by the wrist, pulled her out of the chair with effortless strength, and swiftly locked the heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. The cold metal clamped down over her expensive gold bracelets. She slumped against him, weeping uncontrollably, the ultimate golden child finally facing a consequence she could not manipulate her way out of. The final two marshals stepped up to my father. Pastor Desmond Washington slowly pushed himself up from the table. He looked around the courtroom, seeing the disgusted faces of the jury, the cold stare of the judge, and the unforgiving reality of the armed officers surrounding him. He held his hands out in front of him, surrendering completely as the steel cuffs clicked securely around his wrists. As the marshals began to turn him toward the exit, Desmond stopped. He planted his feet on the floor and looked directly up at me on the witness stand. His eyes were red and swollen, filled with a desperate, agonizing terror. "Nia," he pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Nia, please, you have the power to stop this. Tell them to let us go. I am so sorry. We were desperate, we made a terrible mistake. But you cannot let them take me away in chains. I am your father. I raised you. We share the same blood. Please, in the name of God, show some mercy. We are family." The entire courtroom fell dead silent, waiting for my response. The jury watched me closely, wondering if the brilliant stoic federal director would finally show a crack in her armor. They wondered if the pull of biological obligation would override the cold logic of the law. I looked down from the elevated witness stand. I looked at the man who had allowed my mother to die in financial ruin. I looked at the man who had stood by and watched his golden child humiliate me for decades. I looked at the man who had gladly signed his name to a forged document that would have sent me to a federal penitentiary for 20 years, all to cover up his own pathetic gambling addiction. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no biological pull. I had mourned the loss of my family years ago. The people standing in front of me in handcuffs were just strangers who happened to share my DNA. I leaned forward, my voice perfectly calm, cutting through the heavy silence of the room like a scalpel. "You are not family," I told him, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "You are a security threat." Desmond let out a ragged, devastated gasp. He dropped his head, realizing that he had completely destroyed the one person who had ever truly tried to save him. The final bridge was burned to ash. "Take them out," Judge Sterling ordered. The federal marshals gripped their prisoners tightly and marched them down the center aisle. The heavy tactical boots and the quiet jingling of the steel handcuffs provided a grim soundtrack to their exit. Terrence stumbled forward, staring blankly at the floor. Dominique sobbed hysterically, her designer heels dragging awkwardly against the hardwood. Pastor Desmond walked with his shoulders completely slumped, a disgraced and ruined man. The heavy oak double doors were pulled open by the bailiffs. The marshals marched my family out into the bright, unforgiving light of the hallway, and the heavy doors slammed shut behind them with a resounding, echoing boom. 6 months have passed since that echoing boom sealed the fate of the Washington family. The justice system is often criticized for moving slowly, but when you attempt to extort a high-ranking federal intelligence officer and expose classified military infrastructure, the United States government moves with terrifying speed. The fallout from that day in court was absolute, swift, and completely merciless. Terrence Brooks, the slick real estate developer who swore I would rot in a cell, is currently wearing a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit. He accepted a desperate plea deal to avoid being charged with domestic cyber terrorism, which would have carried a life sentence. Instead, He is serving a mandatory 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. There are no silk ties, luxury vehicles, or country club dinners where he is now. His days are spent mopping cafeteria floors and constantly looking over his shoulder in the exercise yard, stripped of all the arrogance that once defined his entire existence. The destruction of my father, Pastor Desmond Washington, was a public spectacle that shook the entire Atlanta community. The moment I released the unredacted financial audit to his church board of directors, his holy empire collapsed overnight. The local news stations ran the story for weeks as their lead segment. They detailed every stolen dollar, every secret casino trip, and every desperate lie he told from the pulpit while embezzling from the building fund. The congregation he had manipulated for 30 years turned their backs on him entirely. He was formally stripped of his pastoral credentials, evicted from the sprawling church parsonage, and publicly disgraced. He is currently living in a cheap rundown motel on the outskirts of the city, wearing a bulky electronic ankle monitor as he awaits his own federal trial for wire fraud and elder abuse. He faces a decade behind bars, and not a single member of his former flock has come to visit him or offer a dime for his bail. And then there is my sister Dominique. Without the stolen trust fund money, Terrence's massive $2 million debt to the underground loan shark fell squarely onto her shoulders. The federal government seized all of his frozen bank accounts and assets, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the immediate threat of a violent criminal syndicate. She was forced to declare complete bankruptcy. The bank foreclosed on her sprawling suburban mansion. Her luxury vehicles were repossessed in the middle of the night. Her elite socialite friends immediately blocked her phone number, treating her like a contagious disease to protect their own reputations. Today, the woman who once scoffed at anyone making less than 6 figures is working double shifts at a 24-hour diner just to make the minimum weekly payments to keep the enforcers away from her door. She spends her 12-hour shifts wiping down greasy tables and counting spare change, completely trapped in a miserable reality of her own making. The golden child finally got exactly what she earned. I stand alone in front of the polished marble headstone in a quiet cemetery overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The air is crisp and the afternoon sun casts long, peaceful shadows across the manicured grass. I place a fresh bouquet of white lilies down my mother's favorite flowers. I do not come here to apologize for what I did to my father and my sister. I come here to talk to the only person in that house who ever truly loved me, and to reflect on the deeply painful reality that sometimes the absolute most toxic and dangerous people in your entire life are the ones who share your exact DNA. Growing up, our culture demanded that we protect family at all costs. We are taught to keep the dark secrets buried deeply inside the house, to forgive the unforgivable, and to endure endless psychological abuse just to maintain the outward illusion of unity. The community demands that we carry the heavy burden of fixing broken men and appeasing jealous relatives. We are expected to constantly sacrifice our own mental health and financial stability on the altar of family loyalty. But I refuse to participate in that generational curse anymore. I learned the hardest way possible that true Black excellence is not merely about achieving financial success, securing high-ranking corporate positions, or buying luxury homes in affluent neighborhoods. Real excellence is about fiercely protecting your peace of mind. It is about having the absolute unwavering courage to identify the parasites in your life and cleanly cutting them off entirely regardless of their blood relation to you. It is about refusing to let someone else's crippling insecurity and profound greed become the anchor that drowns you. As I turn and walk slowly away from the gravesite, heading back toward my secure vehicle waiting by the heavy wrought iron gates, I feel an incredible sense of freedom. I am finally and completely unburdened. The heavy chains of their toxic expectations have now been shattered forever, and my bright future belongs entirely to me. Have you ever had to use the absolute truth to destroy a lie your family told about you? Tell me your story in the comments. Do not forget to like and subscribe. Remember, your silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it is just you letting them dig their own graves. I want to thank everyone who has listened to my story today. It is never easy to rip the bandages off old wounds, and expose the dark realities of the people who were supposed to protect us. But the truth is, the only thing that can actually set you free. If my journey resonated with you, if it gave you the courage to stand up to the toxic relatives in your life, please share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear it right now. You are so much stronger than the false narrative they tried to write for you today.